There is a rejection letter that changed the 20th century, and it is one sentence long, not qualified for the school, what's below average. October 1907, Vienna. The examiners did not even invite him back for a second round of testing. They looked at the portfolio, they made their notes, and they moved on to the next applicant in line. The young man who received that letter was 18 years old, and he had nothing else. His mother had just died of breast cancer, cared for in her final months by a Jewish family doctor named Edward Bluk, a man who would later describe this specific patient as devoted, gentle, and completely undone by the loss. His father was already dead. He had no trade. He had built his entire adolescent identity around one plan, and the plan was Vienna, and the plan was art, and Vienna had just told him no. He tried again the following year. Same academy, same ambition, and this time it was worse. In 1908, they didn't even let him submit a portfolio for review. What happened after that is not speculation, it is documented in his own later writing and in the testimony of people who knew him during those years. He drifts. He sleeps in a men's shelter, then a hostel on Meldemannstrasse. He sells hand-painted postcards to tourists for a few kronen apiece. And he reads, pamphlets mostly. The cheap anti-Semitic tabloid literature that Vienna was thick with in that decade sold on the same street corners where he was selling his postcards. Historians describe those years as the incubation period, the years when a specific set of prejudices calcified into something closer to a governing philosophy, precisely because he had nothing else occupying his hours. No deadlines, no colleagues, no one asking anything of him at all. I want to ask what happens on the other side of that letter, not because it's a comfortable question, but because the historical record is unusually specific about how close it came to reading differently, and specificity is the only thing that makes a counterfactual worth building. So let's build this one properly, brick by documented brick, before we let it run. The Academy in 1907 was evaluating roughly 113 applicants for around 30 places. Genuinely brutal odds, but the surviving examiner commentary on his submission is not simply no talent. It's more specific and more damning in one direction and forgiving in another. The panel's recorded judgment was that his figure work was weak, almost amateurish, while his architectural and landscape drawing showed real, careful precision. Look at what actually survives from those years. The watercolors of Viennese buildings, the postcards of church facades and street corners. The structures are rendered with genuine control. The people in his drawings, when people appear at all, are stiff, an afterthought, sometimes barely present. He was, by the specific judgment of trained professionals, applying to the wrong department. The School of Architecture would have suited him. He never applied there because Austrian bureaucracy required a secondary school diploma he didn't hold, a paperwork technicality rather than a verdict on ability. So here is the divergence, and I want you to notice how small it actually is. Not a different assassination, not a different war. One examiner in one review session in October 1907, weighting the architectural precision just slightly higher against the figure work than the real panel did. It happens on admissions panels constantly. He is admitted conditionally, the historically standard arrangement for a promising student with an obvious gap required to work under a painting master to bring his figure drawing up to standard before full standing. He walks out of that building not as a man about to disappear into homelessness, but as a matriculated student of the Academy of Fine Arts Vienna. The first thing that changes is not political, it's structural, and it's immediate. He has student housing instead of a shelter bed. He has studio hours instead of empty afternoons. He has an institution that has just told him for the first time since his mother's death that he belongs somewhere. This detail matters more than it sounds like it should. The Vienna of the historical record, the flophouse Vienna, the Vienna where a grown man has nothing to do with his day but read grievance literature on a park bench, is precisely the incubator that biographers point to again and again. Take away the empty hours, and you don't erase the prejudice sitting underneath them. Vienna in this period was saturated with anti-Semitism at every level of society. Mayor Karl Lueger built an entire political career on it, and there's no honest version of this story where that ambient hatred simply vanishes because one man got into art school. What changes is not what he believes. What changes is whether he has the isolation, the wounded pride, and the unstructured time necessary to turn ordinary bigotry into an organizing philosophy for his whole life. Most people carrying that same prejudice in that same city were also carrying student registrations, rent payments, and Tuesday afternoon plans. Ordinary hatred, distributed across a life that has other things in it, mostly stays ordinary. He completes his studies around 1912, let's say modestly, the way the overwhelming majority of academy graduates did. Not a master, a working painter with a diploma and no particular acclaim, the kind of name that appears in no textbook, because that is what almost every graduating class from that era actually produced. Competent professionals who took commissions, who taught private lessons, who lived lives nobody writes documentaries about. Given the specific talent the examiners documented, architectural rendering is the likely path. Building facades for Viennese firms, perspective drawings for construction proposals, maybe a small gallery relationship for the watercolors on the side. This is a smaller story than the one history actually gave us, and the smallness is the entire mechanism doing the work. Then 1914 arrives, and here is where you have to be careful with the counterfactual, because the war does not evaporate simply because one Austrian art student's biography took a different shape. The assassination in Sarajevo still happens exactly as it happened. The alliance system still locks the great powers into mobilization within a matter of weeks. This is a story about the trajectory of one man, not a story about the deeper structural forces that produced the First World War. And those forces were real, and they were enormous, and they were bigger than any single biography could have stopped. He likely still enlists. The historical record shows him volunteering for a Bavarian regiment in 1914, despite being an Austrian citizen, a decision the evidence suggests was driven by genuine patriotic feeling that predates every later political conviction he developed. There's no strong reason to think a version of this man with a diploma and a modest painting career makes a different choice in August 1914. He goes to the front. He may still serve as a dispatch runner. He may still be caught in a gas attack near Ypres in October 1918, may still spend the war's final weeks in a military hospital, temporarily blind, receiving the news of Germany's surrender from a hospital bed rather than a headline. This is where the divergence stops merely persisting and starts to compound. The historical Hitler describes that moment, the surrender news arriving while he lay blinded in that hospital, as the crystallizing point of his political awakening, the birth of the conviction that Germany had been betrayed from within by socialists and Jews and war profiteers, the stab-in-the-back myth that would become the load-bearing wall of everything he built for the next 25 years. That reaction did not arrive from nowhere. It arrived in a man who had already spent a full decade rehearsing personal grievance as an identity, who had no career waiting for him, no craft that had ever claimed him, nothing on the other side of the war, except the exact same void that had swallowed his 20s before it. A painter with a diploma, a client list, and an actual trade to walk back into processes catastrophic national defeat differently, not without pain, not without anger. And there was a great deal of legitimate anger available to any German or Austrian veteran in November 1918. But with somewhere to put himself the following Tuesday morning, that is not a folding chair in the back room of a Munich beer hall. Here is where the documented record runs out completely, and I want to be honest with you about exactly what that means. Everything from this point forward is architecture, not evidence, but it is architecture built on the specific recorded shape of who this man actually was before the war, and its aftermath remade him. And that shape tells us something worth taking seriously. The Nazi Party, as it actually existed, was never an inevitable eruption of German political chemistry waiting to happen no matter who lit the match. It was assembled deliberately and by hand by a specific man making a specific set of choices in a specific Munich political culture between 1919 and 1923, and he brought a very particular skill set to that project. Not artistic skill, not in the way the academy examiners would have recognized it. Rhetorical skill, staging, an obsessive, almost architectural attention to the visual grammar of mass rallies, the banners, the lighting, the choreography of thousands of bodies in a stadium, the repetition of a single symbol until it becomes involuntary in the mind of everyone who sees it. And here is the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. That is not actually a separate talent from the one the examiners praised in his landscape and architectural work in 1907. It is the same eye for composition and structure, simply redirected from canvas onto the theatre of mass politics. Take that specific man out of the beer halls in 1919 and put him instead in a Munich architectural drafting office with a full-time job and evening painting commissions, and German nationalist grievance politics does not simply switch off. The conditions feeding it are still there in full force. Hyperinflation that would wipe out the savings of the entire German middle class by 1923. The war guilt clause of Versailles, the humiliation of a nation that genuinely believed it had been winning until the political collapse at home. All of that grievance is still available in 1919, still radicalizing veterans and shopkeepers and unemployed officers by the thousands, still waiting for someone to organize it into a movement. What is genuinely uncertain, and what serious historians who've actually examined this specific counterfactual keep circling back to, is whether anyone else assembles the same ingredients with the same effectiveness. The failed art student turned mesmerizing rhetorician was a very particular alignment of raw talent, personal catastrophe, and historical accident. Remove that one man, and the vacancy at the head of German extremist politics does not automatically fill itself with an equally capable occupant. Maybe Ernst Röhm, cruder and more purely paramilitary in instinct, builds a smaller, more violent street movement that the German establishment finds easier to crush or absorb rather than negotiate with, the way it had absorbed other armed nationalist gangs throughout the early Weimar years. Maybe Gregor Strasser, more genuinely socialist in his politics, pulls the nationalist right in a direction that never fully consolidates with the industrialists and the old military establishment the way the historical alliance eventually did. Maybe German nationalism through the late 1920s simply stays fractured the way it briefly actually was in the early Weimar period, several competing far-right factions squabbling over the same shrinking pool of resentful voters, none of them ever achieving the singular, magnetic, cult of personality unification that let one man walk into the chancellorship through the entirely legal, mundane mechanics of a fragile coalition government in January 1933. That specific outcome required a level of personal charisma, strategic patience, and sheer performative discipline that was not evenly distributed among his historical rivals. It was concentrated unusually in one man, and we just watched the specific hinge point where that man might never have become that man at all. I want to be careful here because it would be its own kind of dishonesty to suggest that removing one individual removes the 20th century's entire capacity for catastrophe. The structural situation in Europe after 1918 was genuinely, independently dangerous. A humiliated, economically devastated Germany sitting at the geographic center of the continent, surrounded by a peace settlement that satisfied nobody, was a five-alarm problem with or without any single biography attached to it. Some form of German nationalist resurgence sometime in the 1930s is not a fringe prediction. It's close to the working consensus among historians of interwar Europe. What is far less certain, what the evidence genuinely does not guarantee, is that resurgence taking the specific, singular, industrialized, genocidal shape it actually took. The Holocaust as it happened was not simply generic European anti-Semitism scaled up by circumstance and left to run on its own momentum. It required a specific ideological architecture, obsessively built and refined over more than a decade by one man's particular fixations, and then implemented by a state bureaucracy he spent years constructing to his own exact and idiosyncratic specifications, down to the language of the directives. Take away the architect, and you may very well still get a fire somewhere in Europe in the 1930s or 1940s. You are not guaranteed the same building burns down in the same way. So where does our painter actually end up if this alternate decade holds together the way I've laid it out? Somewhere unremarkable probably, which is the strange, quiet, almost anticlimactic place this whole exercise keeps arriving at no matter how you run it. A middle-aged Austrian architectural illustrator by the 1930s, maybe teaching evening drawing classes to supplement the income, maybe never quite achieving the recognition he wanted, which by every account of his personality would have gnawed at him for the rest of his life, regardless of which career he'd landed in, carrying the same raw prejudices that an enormous number of his contemporaries carried across Central Europe in that decade, and never once converting them into anything larger than private bitterness. An ugly remark over dinner, a subscription to the wrong newspaper. Not a redeemed man in this version. Not a good one either, just a small one in the specific and unglamorous way that history's actual monsters so rarely turn out to be pure, inevitable evil, and so often turn out to be pure, ordinary grievance meeting, pure, unearned opportunity at exactly the wrong historical moment, with absolutely nothing standing in between to redirect either one. That's the genuinely uncomfortable center of this whole counterfactual, and I think it's worth sitting inside for a second rather than rushing past it toward a tidy conclusion. We like to tell the story of what happened as though it was always going to happen, as if the 20th century's worst catastrophe was written into some unavoidable script the moment the 19th century ended. The documented, granular history of one rejected teenager's early 20s argues hard against that comfortable version of events. It argues that a specific institution in a specific review session on a specific afternoon in October 1907 made a specific and reasonably defensible judgment about figure drawing versus architectural precision, and that single judgment sat quietly at the base of everything that followed, not the sole cause. History is never that clean, and anyone who tells you it is selling you something, but one removable brick in a structure that looks, the closer you actually examine it, a great deal more contingent, more accidental, and more avoidable than we are generally comfortable admitting. If you want to know what actually became of that rejection letter, and of the specific examiners who signed their names to it, and of the real man on the other side of it, that's a story for a different day, and it's a considerably darker one than the one I just told you. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the kind that finds the smallest, most human scale hinge point in an enormous historical catastrophe and asks what the world looks like standing on the other side of it, tell me in the comments which hinge point you want to examine next. I'll see you on the next one.